All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the Lighthouse. 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is, of course, where we found ourselves last week. 1 Samuel chapter 17, let's read together verses 1 through 4. Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Socoh, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. Well, once again, that's my attempt at Hebrew. I probably didn't get it quite right. Verse 2, And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side. And there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now this is our, second lesson in a series which I've called Giant Slayers. And today our real focus is going to be on naming our giants. You see, David's giant had a name, and so too do ours. And the big challenge for us today is to seek to name the giants that are in our lives. And please don't forget, this is all part of a greater quest, something that we are currently receiving spiritual training for, because we want to have our minds renewed in Christ Jesus and subsequently change the way we think. Now, remember last week we briefly touched on the fact that the Bible readily identifies God's children as being Christian soldiers. And that's because we're engaged in a spiritual war. At least that's how the Bible characterizes the internal struggles that we all wrestle with, a spiritual fight. And as it turns out, nowhere is the fighting more intense within us than in our minds. So it's a battle for the minds that we're engaging in. In this regard, Paul wrote to 2 Timothy and he said, "Endure hardness as a good soldier of Jesus Christ." But as Christian soldiers, our effectiveness in this fight is largely dependent upon the training and the equipping we receive. No army sends its soldiers into battle untrained or underprepared, and neither does God. He doesn't do that to us. In fact, all the way since the start of this year, the Lord has in his own way been steadily preparing us for the fight that lays ahead. All of the struggles we're going to face in life, he is preparing us for through his word. Every time we open the Bible together, every time we discover these important truths, what the Lord is doing is engaging us in spiritual training. We are being trained spiritually. The Bible is literally full of practical examples too, by the way, of God's children engaging in what were rather difficult and challenging circumstances. God's people have faced a great deal of opposition, the Bible reveals. And so what we did was we opened the scriptures last week and we took one particular case study to learn from. And that was the account of David and Goliath. And this is useful for us because not only do we see what God's people did as they faced this challenge in this spiritual fight, but we see the outcome it had in their lives. And so let's let our spiritual training today continue in this regard. What do we learn from the fight between David and Goliath? What did we talk about last week? Well, it was summed up rather well in verse 3. Look at it. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. Our lives are full of valleys. Okay, this is nothing short of a profound truth. Life's full of ups and downs. There's some good times, but I tell you what, there's a whole bunch of bad times too. And when we find ourselves in those low points, in those valleys, what are we going to do about it? Of course, the real value to that lesson is not only recognizing that the valleys are there, it comes in knowing how to navigate through those valleys. In fact, the scriptures openly reveal to us that there are a number of valleys that we might cross during our lives. Remember this? The valley of Siddim was full of slime pits, and it was where the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah got stuck. Do you ever feel stuck in your life? Maybe you're in the valley of Siddim. I don't know. The valley of Eshcol was full of fruit, That's an interesting turn. But the people of Israel were too afraid to cross through it. How many times do we live our lives in fear and fail to claim God's best? That's a valley. It's a very real one. How about the valley of Achor, which was full of trouble because the children of Israel left sin unchecked for a time? Wow, is there some learning in that? You don't want to get stuck in the valley of trouble. The valley of Baca was full of weeping because it was a dry and barren wilderness with nothing flourished without God. The spiritual picture there is enormous. How do we cope? How do we fare in life without God? Well, not particularly well. And it's because we get stuck in the valley of Baca and full of bitter weeping. And there was the valley of Jehoshaphat, the place of God's judgment and decision, a place God had determined to judge all who were wrong before him according to what was right. And, we talk about all these valleys, but do we actually recognize them in our own lives? God is preparing us. He's training us for what lies ahead. And your life will be full of valleys. We need to see it. Where do we find ourselves? Square in the middle of last week. We found ourselves in the valley of Elah. And there in the middle of that valley was a giant named Goliath. Right? Valleys, just one after the next. That's what the Bible teaches us. Those are the lessons that God leaves us to learn from. And they are nothing short of profound. In fact, the most pressing thing in recognizing our valleys comes in knowing that they are not the kind of places where God wants us to dwell. You know that, right? God didn't lead you into the valley so that you could stay there and pitch up camp. He wants to lead you through the valleys. He wants to help you overcome your valleys. He doesn't want you to become stuck in slime or become crippled by fear and too afraid to move. He doesn't want you to become overcome by trouble or to experience bitter weeping in your life without the Lord. He doesn't want you to face the righteous judgment that comes from God in our lives. God never wanted us to become overwhelmed in our valleys. He wants us to cross through them with him. And this is, I guess, where we concluded last week. There are 3 wonderful things that will help you navigate your valleys. 1, know that you're not alone. Right? The Lord is always with those who go looking for his help, even in the midst of terrible valleys. God will be there. There's always, secondly, purpose in your valleys. There are always lessons for us to learn, even in the worst of times. In fact, a lot of the time, we grow the most during those valleys. Have you ever noticed that? There is purpose in your valleys too. And thirdly, and this is, I guess, something you don't want to let go of, there are rewards on the other side of the valley. Okay? There is wonderful blessings. There are great rewards awaiting those who actually pass through the valleys. So that's what the valley of Elah revealed to us last week. And that's where our conflict between David and Goliath began. Interestingly, that term valley of Elah, it actually means God prevails in the Hebrew. Isn't that cool? God prevails even in the midst of our valleys. We know and serve a God who is with us in and through the valleys. That's neat. So then, recognizing all these valleys ahead and knowing now how to navigate through them with the Lord, it is an important aspect of our spiritual training to take another step. That's the first step. What's the next step? Well, we're going to have to face some of our giants, aren't we? You see, the thing that makes valleys so desperately difficult to overcome is the great opposition that dwells there, right? No one wants to get stuck in the valley. No one wants to enter into a valley because there's always these overwhelming obstacles and struggles that seem to await us here. This is the truth that you and I need to understand. In order to overcome our valleys and gain victory in our lives, we need to confront and slay some giants in our lives. This is exactly the position Israel was in. They were in a fight, and the way forward for them was clear. They had to cross the valley. The only problem was, in the middle of that valley, there was a huge giant that was awaiting them. I wonder what your giant is today. We all have our giants to kill, make no mistake. Have a look at verse 4. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath. of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Well, let's consider that for a moment. The fight was imminent. Israel's borders had been invaded. That was clear. The enemy had come, and now their livelihoods were all at stake. They had to fight. That was the predicament they were in. Their lives, their lands, their homes, their families, their crops, their livestock, all was at risk of loss because the enemy had come to take it all. Giant adversary. So Israel had to cross this valley and engage with that enemy. They had to fight the Philistines and push them out of their lands once and for all to triumph. That's pretty straightforward. We can understand that. But there was an enormous problem, and he had a name, and that name was Goliath. You see, David's giant had a name, and so too does yours. Do you know the name of your giant? Do you know what is actually standing in the way between you and God's best in your life? We all have our giants, and they're all standing in front of us and where God is trying to lead us to. But in order to slay your giant, you first have to name it. Do you know what your giant is? For some, our giant goes by the name of fear. We talked a little bit about that last week. For others, it's known by other names like worry or anxiety. For many, the current giant being faced is called depression, while for others it's called addiction. There is a big giant called bitterness, and there is a big giant called anger, and his third cousin is called envy. And trust me, they all have brothers, and they're named insecurity, hopelessness, and despair. Some giants come in the form of marital problems. Some giants come in the form of financial problems. My point is, there are many different giants that we may all be called upon to face. And can you see them looming over you? Yeah? When we talk about these things in these sorts of terms, are you getting a mental picture and a profound sense of who your giant really is? Verse 4 says that Israel's giant was named Goliath. They had a name. That giant had a name. Your giant has a name too. I'm just wondering, though, if you know what it is. Because I can tell you, you will never, ever confront your giant or ever have a hope of defeating it unless you first know its name. You understand that, right? You got to see it, you got to name it before you can defeat it. That's kind of profound. I wish I came up with it, but I didn't. In fact, it was Pastor Dan who taught a series of lessons like this some 10 years ago. And he's the one that taught me that. We all have our giants, and you have to name them before you can defeat them. So what's the name of yours? There might be some of you sitting here today thinking, well, I don't have any giants right now. You know, there's nothing I'm wrestling with or fighting against. And maybe that's precisely the problem. Have you ever thought about that? How are you ever going to overcome the obstacles standing in the way of your relationship with God if you don't think you have any? That's a tough fight. It's the non-existent fight that we're in denial of. How are you ever going to face your problems if you don't know what they are? Have you ever thought about that? It's no small thing to face a giant. But let me tell you this, any small thing that stands in the way of your relationship with God and His best for you, that is a giant obstacle. Okay? We all have them. Giants in our lives. Small things that we ignore can turn into giant problems. So let's get real, because you're not perfect and you're not without your own problems. So what are their names? What giant are you facing right now? I can't answer that question for you. Only you can do that. So name your giant. Now, I know this whole exercise is probably challenging for some. In fact, it's probably rather difficult for many of us because we're still in basic training, aren't we? We're still looking to the Lord to enlighten us about these things. So we're going to let Him do that for us today. And if you're maybe uncertain about what your giant is right now, I can tell you this. There are certain characteristics and common features that all giants have. Every single one of them. And if you can begin to recognize those aspects appearing in your own life, the things that you're struggling with, guess what? It'll help you to identify what your giant really is. So this is what we're going to do today. This is what we're going to do for the remainder of this lesson. We're going to seek to readily identify the giants that exist in our lives. We're going to look at some common distinguishing features that make them readily identifiable. And this might sound obvious to you, but here's the first one. Listen, giants are big. Okay? Giants are big. What did it say? Verse 4. What was Goliath's dimensions? His height was 6 cubits and a span. Now that measure probably doesn't mean anything to the majority of us here today, and yet it is still clearly recorded in God's word for a reason. Why? It's to let you know how big your problems sometimes can get, how large these giants can become, and the shadow that they cast over your lives. God wants you to understand that sometimes you need to face some giants. Many times they're too big for us to even face alone. The ancient measure of a cubit was said to be the distance between the elbow and the outstretched middle finger, so somewhere around there. That was a cubit, right? And a span was said to be the distance taken from an outstretched palm, bottom of the palm, to the top of the middle finger. Goliath was 6 cubits and a span. Now, in today's term, that places these dimensions at around 9 feet 9 inches or 2.97 meters tall, just under 3 meters. Okay? And that's big. That's real big. And I tried to measure it out. And you know what? When you look at a distance on the ground, it doesn't really mean a lot until you stand it up vertically. So how big was this giant? Well, some of the boys helped me this morning, but we've got a measuring tape. And I measured it up. That door frame is under 2 meters, okay? Well under 2 meters, so we need to put another, half a door frame on top of that. But we measured it out against this cross, and 3/4 up the bottom of this cross before it reaches the crossing beam, that is Goliath's height. So roughly speaking, you see where that tinted glass turns orange, maybe just 6 inches or so below that. That is how tall Goliath was. He was a massive, hulking, intimidating beast of a man. And you know what? Sometimes your giants can cast that kind of opposing shadow as well. So what can we conclude from that? Well, giants are big. They are. They pose a big problem. They stand as a big obstacle that we need to overcome. They often spell out big trouble, and they have a big impact on our lives. So what's your giant? David was facing a huge physical adversary, and it was hard for him to miss. The only problem is you and I sit here right in our comfy seats today, and I think sometimes we do miss our giants, don't we? The giants that we face are not physical, they're spiritual, right? And in spiritual terms, sometimes size is very much a matter of perspective. And what I mean by that is often we don't get an accurate measure of what our giants really are. We don't really see them as our problems. We don't really see them as an obstacle that we need to overcome. And we don't really notice the profound impact they are having on our lives. Giants. A lot of times we don't see them because we're too busy looking at the physical world around us, and we're not thinking about things in a spiritual light. Remember the battle that's going on up here within us? What is the thing that is most affecting your relationship with God? That's your giant. Whatever it is, whatever form, shape, look it takes, that's your giant. You're going to have to change your focus in order to see it. Sometimes we need to look at the world not through our physical mindset, but through a spiritual one, to really see what's opposing us, what we're struggling with, what's standing as the obstacle between us and God. How many times have you looked at what other people are struggling with and you've thought, well, that's not a big deal. That's not a big deal. They just need to get over that. They have their health, they have their house, they have their job. That's not a big deal. Well, it's not a big deal to you because you're not the one struggling with it. That's not your giant. And what's more is when you look at things in a physical light, you don't actually understand just how much that giant is affecting them on a spiritual level. We are not all the same people. We have not all had the same upbringings. We do not all have the same backgrounds or culture. We haven't all had the same life experiences, whether they're good or bad. And you know what that means? We don't all struggle with the same things. You can't sit there and look at somebody else and say that's not a big deal. There's an important lesson to learn in that, isn't there? Don't be quick to dismiss your brethren's struggles as being small and insignificant just because it's something you don't readily struggle with. A giant to someone is always going to be a giant obstacle for them. That doesn't change whether you see it or not. Let me ask you another question. How often have you failed to see your own giants, even though it's standing right in front of you? I bet you everyone else is there going, well, that is a massive obstacle for them and they don't even see it. It's like they're completely blind to the giant standing right in front of them. That's why I say it's all a matter of perspective. Sometimes we downplay the giants other people are facing, and all the while we fail to see our own. And brethren, all of that happens because we fail to see things and view them in a spiritual light. And here's the underlying truth. Giants are there, they do exist, and they're always big. Always. It doesn't matter if you see them clearly or not. So can you name your giant? Something else unique to giants is they're not only big, but they all come from a place of origin. They all have a place of origin. They all come from somewhere. Look at verse 4. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath. See that? Gath stood as an ancient city and one of the 5 major cities, in fact, that were dotted around the Philistine territories at the time. And the name Gath itself in the Hebrew means winepress. And considering this reference and to the specific city of Gath is made over 33 times in the Bible, and it has wider references made in other ancient manuscripts from countries like Egypt, all of this seems to suggest that the city of Gath was rather renowned in the ancient world. Goliath was from the city of Gath. Despite what you may have come to think, giants are not mystical, magical, fairy tale creatures. They exist and they are real. And Goliath was a real guy and he came from a real place. And just as the giant David faced was real, so too will the giants that you and I face. But have you ever stopped to consider where do they actually come from? I'm not talking about a geographic place on a map. Remember, our fight's not physical. Goliath was from Gath. I don't know where your giants come from. Do you? We might be using the whole confrontation between David and Goliath to draw a practical analogy from, but it's really a spiritual metaphor, isn't it, for the opposition that we readily face in our lives. As Christians, there are some giant problems that we need to overcome. But where do they come from? Where do they originate? They don't all come from the same place, but they are born out of something in our lives. There is a Gath in everyone's life where all of our struggles seem to stem from. As far as I can tell, these giants namely come from 2 places, and it's from our past things that have happened in the past, and it's from our poor decisions that we're making in the present. That's generally where our giant opposition comes from. What's wrong with our past? Well, often our giants are born out of our past failures, our past regrets, our past shame. The past can be a pretty daunting and foreboding place in that regard. How do you overcome your past? If there's an enormous giant there and you haven't slain it, guess what? Your past is following you everywhere you go. Amen. It's hard to move on and really live in present if there is a giant problem holding you back in the past. I hope you can follow what I'm saying. Still, for some of us, the past isn't really the issue. It's all about the decisions we're making in the present. I don't know how many times my giants have come about because of my own poor decisions. You see how that works, don't you? First, my decisions lead me away from God, and then after a time, I notice I'm in a valley. And what's more than that, there's a giant obstacle standing in the way of me returning to right relationship with God, and that's tough. That's very difficult. Sometimes the greatest giants we all face in life are born out of the poor decisions we're making right now in our lives. So I hope you see and can come to realize we have to slay our giants or they'll end up slaying you. That's what you have to do. But part of that process is recognizing where they come from. Past or present, doesn't matter. Can you name your giant? Now this is, I know, turning into a long message. This is the second week in a row I've had a long one. So we're going to have a brief intermission. I want everyone to stand up, stretch your legs, give someone a hug, tell them you love them, and we'll reconvene in a minute or two. Okay, everyone make your way back to their seats. Hey guys, we've got some giants to slay. Who wants to slay these giants when you can spend all day hugging one another? Okay, so what do we learn? Giants have some common characteristics. They're big, and they all have a place of origin. They all come from somewhere. But this lesson, it would be amiss of me if I didn't talk about the fact that our giants are also formidable. Right? They are. Look at verses 5 through 7. And speaking of Goliath, he had a helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, and one bearing a shield went before him. That's quite an impressive array of equipment that Goliath was bearing to this fight. He was a professional soldier, and he was nothing if not well trained and equipped. He was a rather formidable imposing figure. And in addition to a helmet and a breastplate and greaves of brass upon his leg, he also wore an entire coat of mail. Now, in way of a quick history lesson for you, this must have been a really impressive adornment to see. This coat of mail was not like maybe one that you would think of in a traditional sense that the Romans wore. This actually comes out in the Hebrew more as a coat of scales. And this is more what historians and Bible scholars seem to agree was consistent with that time period. Goliath was not wearing a chainmail shirt, but rather a coat of scales. Now, what would happen is the armor smith would take metal and he would flatten them out into small little metal sheets. And then he would cross those sheets progressively over in an adjoining protective barrier that the soldier would wear. A coat of scales. And really it created a protective covering rather like a fish's scales, okay? Scale armor was said to provide a strategic advantage in war at the time because it offered additional protection to the wearer without seriously impeding movement. It was a technical marvel on the ancient battlefield, and interestingly was said to have first been crafted and perfected within the Aegean coastal regions, which is where the Philistines originated. And what's also noteworthy is, the Philistines were largely a coastal people, and they worshipped the deities of the sea, like that of Dagon. And Dagon was represented through inscriptions and idols, carved idols, as being a figure with a man's face and hands, but a body made up of scales and a fish's tail. So, for all intents and purposes, Dagon was a merman, a merman. And this is where the Philistines had drawn this particular design from their armor from. It was a coat of scales. Now, Goliath's coat of scales weighed 5,000 shekels of brass. And I was curious about that. So again, I did some research to find out what that actually was. And, 5,000 shekels of brass is rather a difficult measure to come up with. Because not only is the shekel a very ancient measure, but it's likened to the first real primitive measure of weight used. And it varied enormously depending on what you were measuring with the shekel. For most early nations, a shekel corresponded to the weight of a single coin used in their common currency. Of course, when measuring larger weights, this varied enormously depending on the type of coin that particular nation used as its currency. And in the Bible, you know what we find? We find shekels of gold, shekels of silver, shekels of brass, shekels of iron, all different variations to the weight and the measure of a particular metal given. Now, why is this important to us? Why did God actually put this here? This is a statement. It's a fact that the Bible gives. Goliath wore a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. Now, at the very least, you can understand, if you understand a shekel to be a coin, you can imagine Goliath covering his body with 5,000 coins, right? But it was a little bit more advanced than that because that was melted down and formed into a particular sheet of armor. But you know what? Me carrying around a sack of 5,000 coins, that's a significant weight. I'm sure you would agree. But what most Bible scholars seem to attribute all the combined metal of this scale of coat of scales weighing would be around 125 pounds, or in our terms, around 56 to 57 kilos. That's quite a weight. So that's like 1.5 of my boys, putting them together. And Goliath just whipping that up on his shoulders every time he goes out to fight. Remember, he also had a helmet, he had a breastplate, he had greaves, he had a sword and a spear. And verse 7 tells us that the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam. Now, that's reference to a particular piece on a loom, okay? A loom used for weaving in ancient times. And it was, for all intensive purposes, a strong, long, rounded pole. something well above the size of a standard spear shaft. This was like a block of wood sort of thing. And this is what Goliath was carrying, and attached to the end of that was a spearhead that weighed 600 shekels of iron. That's about 15 pounds or 7 kilo. I would struggle to throw 7 kilo on its own, let alone having it attached to a weaver's beam at the same time. But this is how Goliath was arrayed. And this is the best part of all. Look at the end of verse 7. And one bearing a shield went before him. What? How's anyone supposed to win this fight? Doesn't seem fair, does it? It's entirely rigged. On one side, there's Goliath, the Philistine champion, a great hulking shadow of a man, adorned with head to foot with the very best protection money can buy. The latest technical war advantage he carried with him into battle. He had weapons of destruction in his hands, and he had a personal shield bearer that went in front of him to try to deflect and block attack. And who was his opponent? Well, it was David, a shepherd boy out of Israel, who had no fighting experience, no armor, and no military weapons to speak of, just a sling and a staff. And guys, you know who David represents in this depiction and account, don't you? That's us. We're David in this fight. Now, if you learn nothing else from this account, these verses, you need to understand this. Goliath was a formidable adversary. There's no other way to put it. This was the giant that David had to face and overcome. And you know what? He couldn't do it alone. He wasn't going to do it with a staff and a sling with a few small stones. He needed help. Sometimes we don't recognize just how formidable our giants are, do we? We don't think they're a big deal. We don't think that they're going to have any real impact on our lives. And we're all that much more surprised when we see them pop up because we don't know where they came from. But at the end of it all, you know what? They prove themselves, these giants, time and time again, to be incredibly formidable. We can't take that for granted. Have you ever noticed how the giants you face are somehow perfectly suited to opposing you? They seem to have it all together. I mean, Goliath certainly did. He had every advantage he could get, and he took that with him into battle. Our giants know the secrets and the weaknesses that they can exploit. Our giants know how to hit you exactly where it hurts. Your personal giants are formidable. Of course, the things that create giant problems for me may not be a giant problem from you. We're all rather unique in that way. But whatever giants we are facing, whatever name and face they carry, whatever place they are from, trust me, they are all formidable. So we've got to get ready for this. Can you name your giant? Something else rather common for the giants that we face in our lives is they are relentless. Man, they don't give up. They don't back down. They're there every day, every direction you look. You can't get away from your giants. Goliath was a professional soldier. He was nothing if not well armed and equipped. And you know what? He let everybody know it. He stood up right in the face of Israel. And he demanded someone to come and take him on. And he was relentless with this attack. Look at verse 24. It says, and all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were sore afraid. This giant, there's no secret attack. It's no hidden, surprise ambush. Goliath just went out into the battlefield and he demanded someone to take him on. But everyone was too afraid to do it. You know what the term champion means in the Hebrew? It actually speaks of one standing between two armies. Isn't that interesting? The one standing between two armies. This really speaks of the position that Goliath took up on the battlefield. And I can almost imagine this as these little skirmishes were taking place down in the valley with neither army really wanting to commit the full power of its force down. There was these little skirmishes going on, and Goliath would walk out into the middle of it, and there would just be this wide circle that he would create around him wherever he went as he looked to take on someone to fight. Wow. Everyone was too afraid to step up and take on Goliath. But he was relentless in his pursuit. How relentless? Look at verse 16. And the Philistine drew near morning and evening and presented himself 40 days. 40 days in a row, Goliath came, both morning and evening, and said, come on, let's get into a fight. Relentless. Relentless in this attack. Are you beginning to get any idea of what giant you're struggling with? Can you name it? What is that thing that just won't go away in your life? You have to put your giants down, or they'll put you down, because they're relentless with their attack. You have to name your giant before you can defeat your giant. Can you name it? This leads us to the best thing, I think, about this whole lesson, right? Giants are big. They all come from somewhere. They're formidable. They're relentless. But you know what? They can be defeated. Have a look at verse 48. And it came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took thence a stone and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, and the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. And so prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood upon the Philistine, and took his sword and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him and cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Quite a change of circumstances and events. David didn't just see his giant. He didn't just name his giant. He confronted his giant and he defeated his giant. You see how that works? This is the best part of the story of all. And it only ever happened because of God's presence and his help in this young man's life. Isn't that great to know that we always have God's help to confront our giants? Now, we haven't got time to get into all that today, but tell you what, we're going to look at this fight and the details of the struggle in future weeks. But what have we learned today? What is the real key that I want you to take away from this lesson? If you're going to defeat your giant, you have to name it. Do you know what your giant is? We've got to get real about this, don't we? Our giants are big, they all come from somewhere, they are formidable and they are relentless in their attack, but they can be put down. So this is our challenge, and I guess this is your challenge for this up and coming week. It's that you would see and recognize, and more to the point, readily name your giants. Because next week, you know what we're going to do? We're going to face them all together. In this very room, we're going to open the Word of God, and we're having named our giants, we're then going to face them together. So thank you for your attention. Everyone please stand.